Okay, so I'm gonna turn off the music. Goodbye, TLC. There you
Never goodbye TLC. We're just gonna turn it off for now.
All right. Well, why don't we actually get started? It's 11:07. We have over 120 folks online right now dialed into this conversation. I am really, really excited to have you all here. Can you all hear me okay now? Or is it still quite hard?
Folks are yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm really excited to be here, not only with all of you, but with Dr. Kim Tran, who is, I think, the perfect person to be in conversation with about this very topic. So we're gonna do a quick introduction and explain how we're coming to this work, how we've been experiencing this subject with our family members, and also just go over some context around what we're hearing from many people in our communities and how we're going to structure this conversation. So I'll go first. For those of you who don't know, I'm Michelle Kim. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Awaken. We do diversity, equity, and inclusion training for mostly for-profit companies, but all over the country and the globe. And I come to this work really, with my passion and background in social justice work. So I started doing, diversity and inclusion. I put that in quotation marks because I think over the years that term has been so diluted and co-opted in so many different ways in the corporate space. But really my origin of the work began when I was politicized as an LGBTQ youth activist. So I am a queer Korean American person, woman of color, and I'm also an immigrant to this country. So I was born and raised in South Korea until I was 13, and I moved to the US to be with my dad. And he was an undocumented immigrant for over 10 years. And I brought my mom over when I was in college. So, lots of immigration background, and I'm a Korean American and I'm queer. And so I inhabit all those identities when I step into spaces like this to have conversations around all things social justice. And I also am really, really cognizant of the fact that we can't represent the entire Asian diaspora that are present in this conversation today, but also folks who are doing incredible work outside of this space. So I think it's important that we don't take what me and Dr. Kim Tran says today as the answer to all of our problems and challenges, right? So just want to be really transparent about that. And what else? I want to pass it over to Dr. Kim Tran to talk about you.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm always really excited to have this conversation. I've been having it for a while. I'm thrilled to have this one with you, Michelle. My name is Kim for folks. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I've been doing anti-oppression work for about 13 years in this specific way, right? So I started doing what we called cultural literacy work about 13 years ago around LGBTQ youth and in schools, in a health setting. And then it became anti-oppression work. And now I think a lot of folks call what I do professionally diversity, equity, and inclusion. For me, this comes from two specific places. One is my research, and the second is my movement work. So my research is on cross-racial solidarity. I'm writing a book on the end of allyship and the new era of solidarity that we're seeing. And so part of that is this conversation, Asians for Black Lives, A4BL, what it looks like. I'm also an organizer. So right now I am working with a coalition of folks who are trying to defund police in the Eastside Union High School District in San Jose. So it's this piece, this question, these conversations are really near and dear to my heart. Michelle and I are really aligned in identities. So my friends like to call me professionally gay or professionally queer. And I come from a refugee family. So my mom is where I practice these conversations a lot. It's where that conversation began, lives and ends for me. Just, how do we get our movement to be intergenerational? How do we talk to our cousins? How do we talk to our siblings, our friends, and our families? Because that's, the project that's closest to our hearts. And that's actually oftentimes what Black organizers are asking us to do.
Yeah, thank you. Can you share a little bit about your dissertation?
Oh, God. Sure. So I got my PhD a couple years ago now from UC Berkeley. I went in, when did I start grad school? I'm not going to tell you when I started grad school. So I finished a few years ago. I have my PhD in ethnic studies, and my research was on how Asian Americans form this cross-racial coalition with Black Lives Matter. And it was some of the work I was doing myself. And so that's where it came from. Like, I'll just write about the thing that I'm doing myself. And also, you know, as two communities, we're often pitted against each other in a way that's different from other communities, right? Mm-hmm. So this history of antagonism between API folks and Black folks has its own specific lineage that is important. And the ways that we talk about it depend on very specific narratives, stereotypes, tropes, and it's kind of got its own circuitry of white supremacy within it. So the way that we're going to undo that also has to be specifically culturally nuanced. And I really just flesh that out in 4 chapters. Like, what does it look like to think about a Black feminist framework in this work? What does it look like to do this as an Asian American with my own history of racial trauma? And what does it look like to do this as a community that's been so impacted by things like the model minority, and by racial triangulation?
Yeah, I think, you know, all of the nuances that you just pointed out, I think is what makes this conversation sometimes really challenging and complex for our community, right? I think, you know, you and I have talked about this, where there's a lot of conversations right now happening around allyship, right? And a lot of tips being given to people, and specifically white folks, that may or may not work for our community. So I think being able to really hone in on our own complexities of our identities, our struggles, and being able to translate that in our conversation with our families who are, you know, who are coming from a lot of different types of backgrounds and lived experiences, I think is so key. So I'm really excited to begin this conversation with you, and I think you're the perfect person for it, given all the work that you've been doing and how values aligned we are when it comes to talking about coalition building and allyship, specifically in addressing anti-Black racism within our communities. I wanted to do a quick polling to see who's in the room, and see, you know, just show the sort of the diversity of our community. So I'm going to launch a quick poll while we transition to some slides.
Should I answer this too? I just introduced myself, so I'm like, maybe I should do it too.
I don't know if we can actually.
I totally can't participate at all.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I totally excluded you.
Totally cool.
And obviously these categories are not exhaustive, right? I tried our best. We tried our best, and there is a character limit. So that was a real factor in not being able to name all of the identities. And absolutely, you're welcome to put your identities into the chat too, if you want to rather self-describe yourself.
Yeah, and I think we also want to be cognizant of the fact that folks are mixed ethnicity, that folks are mixed race, and that oftentimes the research and the methods that we use can't capture the nuance of that reality. So, you know, polls are limited in the ways that research is limited.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so 88% of you have voted, so I'm going to close it out in 5 seconds.
I like how structured you are about time.
I'm unlearning a lot of that, actually. It's a conversation for a later time.
Time is a colonial construct too.
That's right.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. Part 2. All right. Ending poll. 90% of you have voted, and let me share the results so you can see. So we have 50%, 52% of you who are East Asian, 1% Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, 41% Southeast Asian, and 7% South Asian. It's actually really cool to see so many Southeast Asian folks present, because normally I feel like I see a ton of East Asians and South Asians at these events. So Yay, that's awesome. And some multiracial, biracial folks, and 1% Black, African American, Middle Eastern, and 6% white folks. So I think it's important for us to actually kind of talk about who we have designed the space for, right? And for folks who don't identify as Asian, welcome. We are glad to have you here. And I want to make sure that the Asian folks who are here feel like this space is meant for us to really process. And part of doing work within our own community is that, one, we get to sort of ask ourselves and push ourselves to hold each other accountable, and that we do this work without causing additional harm in other communities. So that's sort of the purpose of these types of spaces, I think. And for anyone who identifies as Black, I think it's important that you do also whatever you need to do to take care of yourself in this conversation. If it's no longer helpful and useful information for you, then it's totally fine for you to, kind of check out for a while, or to just leave entirely if that's what's best for you. So I just want to name that.
I want to add just one thing here, and that is that I'm a really big fan of the affinity group formation. And just as an example, a couple of months ago, Viet Solidarity Action Network had a national call, and there were hundreds of people on this call. And one of the things that I thought was the most powerful about it was that there were a ton of Vietnamese people who could process our own grief and our own responses to anti-Blackness together, and not put that emotional labor on Black folks that we were organizing with, right? Yep. And so we're getting fired up, we're grieving in our own way, and we're processing with other folks who want to hold it and can hold it, as opposed to putting that on a community that's impacted so differently than ours in this work. Yeah. So that's kind of how I came into also thinking about what this conversation would look like, and who it's meant for.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for adding that. All right, so we've been having this conversation around fighting anti-Black racism for some time, and I think recently we've been in different spaces navigating this. And the question that I've personally gotten the most has to do with, how do we engage our family members in this conversation? So we're really narrowing the scope today to give you some tools and practical strategies, and also to share some stories of our trials and tribulations around how we've overcome this. And by the way, I'm pretty sure my mom's on here, so FYI.
Hi.
Hi, Mom. Thank you for being here. But here are some tweets that you may relate to. Talking to Asian parents about BLM is dead ass like talking to a wall. I'm sorely disappointed. How many of you have had that experience? Yep. Sorry. I'm just gonna let you read a couple of these. And the one that really stuck out for me, that kind of broke my heart when I saw it, was this one. First generation Asian Americans trying to explain the BLM movement to their immigrant parents. I just want to give this person a hug. I think it's also really important that we acknowledge that there are some really real cultural barriers, and sometimes that comes in the form of language barriers. That's been one of the most, I think, heartbreaking things for me to witness in our community, where there is so much intention and will to engage our family members, and yet the language and the frustration with not knowing how to talk about these very nuanced concepts and theories and historical backgrounds because of our lost language and our ability to connect with our family members. I think that's by design, sort of another unique form of oppression that Asian Americans face. So that's been really heartbreaking for me. And so we want to start with this main question of, I don't know where to even start talking about this with our family. I don't think that they are paying attention, or I don't think that they care. So where do we really start when we haven't historically have had this conversation with our family members? How can we even begin? So let's start our conversation here, Kim. Do you have any first initial thoughts on where to begin, and how did you start having these conversations with your family?
Oh God. So I will start by saying that my mom is a voracious news consumer. She reads the American papers, she listens to the Vietnamese news. And so we didn't always talk about politics together. Like I'm totally a protest baby. My first protest was at 3 years old with my mom at a city council thing. And she like wanted a bathroom in the park. Like that's who my mother is. So I will start there. My mom is that guy. Like she's highly, highly informed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it wasn't that hard to just, I think everything in my family happens in a kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
So ask her if she had seen it, right? There's this thing that we do in journalism when we say, can your story be pegged to something? And it's a really good way to just introduce the topic by asking if someone has even heard of what's going on. And the vast majority of the time, this is national news. People have heard of it, right? And it doesn't have to be like, are you with BLM? Like you don't have to come like that always. You can absolutely just start with, what are you seeing in the news about the uprising, about the protest? Are your friends talking about it? Or if you are doing work around it, saying, hey, I started doing this thing. What do you think?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Michelle, where has the conversation started for you? I kind of want to ask your mom, but we're
I
not going to
know.
put her on the spot.
Like, Mom, do you want to come online? She's probably yelling at me. Like, no. So I started with a very similar approach, just asking how my parents are thinking about it. So my mom and dad are divorced, so it's often two very separate conversations that I have with each of them, and the strategies are very different too. My mom, over the years, became a little bit more politicized than my dad, I think. And, she and she's come to protest with me in the past. And so I think she's a lot more open to learning, and she's on all the social media accounts that I have.
Wow.
She's on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and TikTok.
She's on TikTok.
She's on TikTok.
That's fantastic.
I think that's her favorite social media platform right now. So she's actually consuming a lot of information. So it's actually a lot more easier. It's a lot easier for me to have some conversations around things that she's seen, or she has questions about it, to engage in that conversation, versus my dad, who is a very sort of the stereotypical model minority Asian dad who doesn't talk a lot about things outside of his work, and he works extremely hard to ensure there's stability financially for him and his family. And so for him, it's a little bit of a different approach, and I have to start by asking some questions around, hey, have you been watching the news about what's going on? What do you think about it? Do you have any questions? And just kind of opening the door for him to ask me questions versus me coming at it with more of a didactic, how dare you don't know these things type of approach, right? Because I don't think that goes well in a variety of situations and for a variety of reasons. So questioning has been a really helpful approach for me, and just sort of seeing, engaging where he's at with regards to how he's interpreting and perceiving the entire, uprising situation.
Yeah, and I love that we're both coming at it from a similar space of like, get curious about your family as opposed to assuming they're gonna say this horrible thing. Like I think prepare yourself for potentially a challenging conversation, but also prepare yourself for maybe it going well too. Like that's also a possibility. I call her my baby cousin, but she's like got a kid and she's married and she's older. But I was talking to my baby cousin about something recently because they started doing this defund police work in a school district where she works. We both went to school in the East Side, and now she works in the East Side Union High School District in San Jose. And first I was like, hey, I'm looking for some teachers to work with me on this thing. Do you know of anyone? And then I thought, well, why don't I ask her? And so I was like, hey, I'm doing this thing. What do you think? Right. Yeah. And in a way that was somewhat surprising to me, she was like, I'm totally down. Like, I'll, you know, push out the petition, do this stuff with you. I absolutely think that we need more counselors in schools. So finding some sort of common ground, whether it's what they do for a living, that they've always been committed to things like education. Like, maybe you're not talking about, you know, BLM immediately, but you can start by saying, hey, you're a teacher. Hey, you work with students. Um, you know, talking about abolition is actually really vital to something like an educational goal, right? And presenting it with curiosity and with generosity and compassion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that curiosity, generosity, and compassion are all necessary components to us being able to engage our family members. And I think we also have to remember that it took me years to be able to have conversations around, you know, anti-Black racism, racism at large, and just understanding the systemic oppressions that we are living within. And I think that is such a privilege that a lot of people don't have, right? The access to education, access to this language. And I think in our culture today, there's this sort of trying to prove who is the most, you know, critical about, you know, analysis or theory or how we're approaching this conversation. And I think that really needs to be checked when it comes to having conversations with our family members who may not have had college degrees or college education or been surrounded by people who are talking about these issues in this type of way.
Yeah, and I think we do this, I really appreciate that, Michelle, because I think we do this out of a place of love as opposed to a place of animosity. And I always try to start and end in that place, right? There's a reason Cornel West, Bell Hooks, June Jordan all talk about love as this revolutionary force. And when we're trying to work with our families, that can be the most clear thing, is like, I love you and I'm trying really hard to have this conversation with you because I want our relationship to go well, right? Yeah. And I'm doing this and this is important to me.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. So as a reminder for folks, if you have any questions that you'd like us to address, please make sure to use Q&A so we can go over it together. And also note in your question that you're submitting, if you want to actually come on video or audio to share some context around the questions, you can feel free to do that. We want to be able to be in conversation with you. So if you want to be a part of the conversation via video, if you feel, don't be intimidated, that would be great. So just let us know in the question that you're submitting. Let's go to the next question that we've gotten a lot from the registration form and also just, you know, day-to-day conversations that I've been having. So how can we, this is really around how can we actually talk about anti-Black racism when Asian people are right now under attack, right? How can we also do this with our parents who may have had experiences of, you know, being othered and being ostracized or being harmed because of their Asian heritage? How do we really make sure that we're creating space to hold all of these things at the same time?
This is actually an entire chapter of my dissertation. So it boils down to this one big piece. I want you to ditch the language of privilege. Just let it go. It can die a quick death in this conversation, especially for families that have endured tremendous trauma. The language of privilege is, one, really white, and two, doesn't resonate, because privilege is by definition the thing that we haven't earned, the thing that we don't recognize. And for a lot of Asian Americans, especially our elders, they're like latched on to that idea that they have fought hard, because they have, right? My family went through 3 refugee camps before they finally wound up in Brooklyn, very, very poor. And so it's not going to be effective for me to be like, you're so privileged, right? They have experienced incredible anti-Asian racism. They've experienced incredible obstacles. So I think one of the things that has worked really well in the past is acknowledging that and really unpacking it first. Like, I know that you all have survived a war. I know that you all have been through whatever it is that you've been through. And in no way, shape, or form am I trying to disregard that, right? Or say that that was easy. At the same time, we're going to bring in this contrast of when you are going for a walk, you're not really scared that a police officer could kill you on sight. And that's a very different experience. right? And so really actually contrasting those realities, but not, and this is the critical factor, not denying Asian American folks their own experiences with racism and saying that those are less or saying that those don't mean anything, which I think when we get heated, we can say, just making sure we maintain the integrity of that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about privilege without using that word, exactly the way that you just did, by using specific examples. And I think, again, I think it's about understanding the context that you're in and the relationship that you have with your parents and their sort of level of understanding around these issues. Maybe you have activist parents who understand privilege. And in that case, you're absolutely, okay to be able to kind of talk about how that manifests. But in my experience too, I think it's a lot more difficult for folks to not understand the issue from the point of their own lived experiences. And I think it's important for us to address that first and foremost, to validate their struggles, validate their fears, validate their painful experiences and memories of being in this country and being, coded as a perpetual foreigner or being less than. And for in my dad's instance, it's literally being exploited by people of all races as an undocumented person, right? And I think those types of painful memories need to be acknowledged and validated and named first. And then we can go from there to expanding their context and providing them with some historical context or the reality that Black folks are living in. And from there, I think they can be more open to actually hearing about these other lived experiences that they may not be privy to.
Yeah, and I think for me, I use statistics very sparingly and I use research very rarely because I'm like that guy in my family. I'm the first one to get a PhD and like no one likes being lectured at. But sometimes it can be really helpful if we're talking about that context, right? So for instance, we know from resume studies that if you have a Chinese or Indian sounding name, you're going to get called in for an interview 30% less for a job, right, than a white person. And we can start there, absolutely. But when we step it out, Black folks actually get called 50% less, right? And so we start with the thing that we know. Yes, absolutely, we experience racism. We expand out and we see a different impact or a different footprint, right? And that can go along with other, historical factors, like Asian Americans were brought to this country in the 1800s to be paid labor, importantly, not enslaved, not paid well, right? And so we have to think about the pieces of research and evidence that really help us out in this conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so critical. And I think also sometimes what people struggle with, I think, is also showing them why we also benefit and how we also benefit from combating anti-Black racism and how the forces that are oppressing Asian people is the same force that we see oppressing Black people. And I think that clarity is sometimes lacking because, it all comes down to, well, what's in it for me, right? Like, why would I go out of my way to help a community that's not necessarily mine in order for me to risk what I have or to lose what I have or to be seen as something that is not anything less than sort of the model minority myth. And I think that conversation sometimes is difficult for our family members to actually understand, like, what's in it for me? Why would I go to a protest in this environment?
Which I always think is a funny thing for people who come from revolutionary backgrounds, right? Like, what I remember, I had a student, a former student who's also an organizer, tell me this in a class once, that they were trying to talk to their mom about BLM like 5 years ago. And she couldn't get it. She was just like, why is property destruction a thing? Why, do we have to like march out in the streets like this? Like, ask for legislative change, ask for policy change. And my student responded by saying, I want you to think about what would make you angry enough to break a window. Is it if someone
Mhm.
killed me and no one held them responsible? Is it that someone killed dad and no one made them and no one held them accountable? Is it that someone killed your sibling or your cousin or your friend? Because that's what happens to Black Americans like every day. And now we have the names and now we have the numbers. And so really starting with that place of like imagine the atrocity that's actually lived experience for so many people, because you've also lived through some really terrible things. I
Yeah.
don't think it's unfathomable. I think our communities have experienced really horrifying realities that are different but equally horrifying, right, in
Yeah.
some ways.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful, what you just said around asking those questions for them, like what would make you angry enough for you to destroy property and to go out and march in the streets for days on end, or weeks in this case. And I also, there's a lot of pushbacks around property destruction. And I think there's also something around the media portrayal that I've gotten in conversations with my dad about, where, oh, like they're always showing Black people doing XYZ things. Why are they doing that if they want to be, safe from being murdered? And something that I use that was actually helpful, and I didn't know if it was going to work. And this is something that you're going to realize in conversations with your family members. You might have to try a lot of different things before something really lands and clicks for people, is talking about their experience in their home countries. So I brought up how, in South Korea, there's actually a lot of conversations around propaganda and media sort of, diverting the attention from the real issues at hand, or talking about the Gwangju uprising in South Korea, where, lots of people actually died at the hands of the Korean military. And kind of drawing some parallels. They're not the same issues, absolutely not. And the race relations, it's very different in Asia, right? But somehow I think those parallels of showing these are folks that who fought for our rights to democracy, or you fought in that protest, you went to that protest, or what's going on in our home country, and these are some of the similarities that we can draw in the US, and the sort of the history and the memories of fighting for their rights in their home countries can have a positive impact, and having them draw those parallels to what's going on today for the Black community.
I love that. And I think this is a great example of why using a white lens doesn't work. Right? Like we have our own histories of fighting against oppression. In Vietnam, that's like what we do. Like we've just been fighting colonizers forever until the 70s. So we have our own histories of fighting back, and we have our own reasons for fighting back, and we have our own legacies that we can talk about and draw upon, right? So as a community that really intensely knows what it means to resist oppression, it's really easy to like actually draw on some community specific stuff here. As opposed to, reading an article that's built for suburban white folks. Like that's not going to work. Our communities have a different history, have a different geography, and we function differently, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, what was I going to say? The Asian, the struggles around property and the wealth, I think is also really unique, right? So for my dad, and also a lot of store owners, the business owners, and we think back to the LA riots, right? When the majority of property destruction happened in Koreatown in LA. And we also have to talk about sort of what led to that point, and the killing of LaTesha Harlins. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that, I encourage you to look it up, but essentially a Korean store owner shot a 15-year-old LaTesha Harlins, a Black young woman who was purchasing, or who was going to purchase, orange juice. And I think there's this tension always between the Asian community and the Black community because of our identity I think being so closely tied to anti-Blackness and how we are being seen as the good immigrants or the good people of color. And I think with all of that, the property destruction piece is also really near and dear to Asian people who feel and who have worked really, really hard to get to a certain level. And all of a sudden they're feeling threatened and they're scared of being at the receiving end of the, this movement in the most sort of negative and destructive way for them, right? Because they're now, I'm also hearing from small business owners that I am already struggling with the pandemic. And now I have even more expenses that I need to think about because my windows were broken or because, people are only patroning Black businesses, Black-owned businesses. How do we deal with that when we're physically and materially hurting? I think being told to just sacrifice and to just support the movement for the sake of supporting the movement at the expense of their well-being, I think is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of folks who've worked really, really hard to get there, right? Have you been hearing that tension as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that's really common because the Asian American dream in many ways is shaped around this capitalist endeavor thing of like, you want your own store. And it's because we've been pushed to these ethnic enclaves, right? So like you have a Koreatown, you have a little Saigon, you have Chinatowns, and we fought really hard for that space and for that piece of the pie, basically. But so much of that functions around a scarcity mindset. So what we're worried about is we're going to lose the tiny piece that's been given to us, as opposed to thinking about what happens when everybody gets a piece, right? And the thing that I like to say, or the thing that I've said to my family in response to this is, but imagine if everyone had access to gainful employment, right? And so you weren't so terrified that your one thing that you had to fight so hard to build will stay standing, right? What if everyone had access to gainful employment? What if you could have a store that thrives next to a Black-owned business that thrives? And we cared about our community enough that we could alleviate the kinds of ways that we have to compete against each other.
Yeah.
Right. And that's actually a very different framing of that question than we don't want Black folks to break our windows. We're like afraid of that reality because that is also racially loaded. So, if you're watching TV and you see a Black person, they're 4 times more likely to appear in a criminalized way. It's going to be a mugshot. It's going to be in cuffs. It's going to be something of that nature versus you're going to see, depictions of Black folks who are like just living their lives. These are different things. And so we're conditioned to fear something. And then we're also conditioned to really want something because our frame of understanding it is so narrow.
Yeah.
And so in my family, what I've done is just broaden that framework out. Like, what if none of us had to fight this hard for this thing?
Yeah.
Because we're just programmed to be like, yeah, you just have to fight hard and hang on for all you've got. And broadening that out can change the conversation.
Yeah, 100%. I also think you're speaking to the lack of exposure to different stories and narratives for our parents, especially, right? Who may not be on social media, like my mom, who's following all kinds of people doing great work. But my dad, his only source of, hearing about these things is through the news, through the Korean media channels, or through, his lived experiences of witnessing something or experiencing something. And I think it's important for us to be sort of pushing for different narratives and introducing them and expanding their, resources, channels where they're consuming information. I think that's also a role that we can play in being able to counteract all the stereotypical and harmful negative images that people are receiving through the media.
And I think this is a really great opportunity to actually build with your family, right? Like sit down and watch news with them once in a while. Or, I will do that with my mom. If she's watching something, I'm like, what the hell is this? Where did you get this? And I might not say it just like that, but I'll just be like, who sent this to you? It's on Facebook. So maybe we get our news not from Facebook. And can I show you something else? right? Because these are, you know, our parents. And if we want the practices to change, we don't start with, stop watching this, actually model something else. Like, I love this news source. It's really vetted. I get a lot of my stuff from here. Will you watch a couple things with me?
Yeah.
Is a different conversation.
Yeah, totally. I want to share one quick story about that has to do with the second question here about what if our parents have been harmed directly by Black people in the past. I think that's a really nuanced and complex question. So I'm trying to check my mom's still here. So I'm going to share her story. So when she first moved to the States a few years ago, she was mugged at gunpoint at night by a Black person. It was a really traumatic experience for her. She was, you know, hit, and her purse was stolen. And a few days after, when she was walking down the street, she saw a Black person walking towards her, and she crossed the street. And that Black person noticed that, because it's a daily microaggression that Black folks experience, and shouted at my mom saying, "Why did you cross the street? I'm not a threat." So I think that when I heard the story of her being mugged at night at gunpoint, and a few days later, her recounting that experience of her not knowing what to do, right? But sort of reacting because of this trauma that she had just experienced, and the grappling us together and having that conversation around, I am really sorry that happened. And I think we really also need to work on making sure that experience doesn't translate into her treating every Black person as though they're a threat to her, right? But it's a really nuanced thing where you don't, like, I don't want to diminish the experience that she just had, and I want her to feel held and validated for the trauma that she just went through. And as a part of that healing process, how do we make sure that reality can coexist with the reality of microaggressions and anti-Blackness Black people face every single day, right? So I just wanted to share that, because I don't think there's a clear-cut, simple yes or no answer to how we're dealing with this conversation. But I think it's that we all have the capacity to stretch and expand ourselves and our families' capacity to hold complex things, and to have these complex feelings and emotions that come up depending on our context and lived experiences, and that we get to sort of hold that all at the same time. And I think in order for us to do that, we need to really stretch our, you know, compassion and empathy and emotional sort of willingness to be able to hold these types of nuances at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Thank you for sharing that. And I know your mom's on the call, so I'm sorry to your mom for that happening to her. I'll also say that's happened to me twice. So I've been mugged once with a violent weapon, both times by Black folks. And I think if I were a different person, I might have gone in a different direction with how that changed how I understand race. For me, that became a thing for my mom, right? Of her fear for me began to feel very specific. And one of the things that I think I am blessed to live in a multiracial community, and I grew up in a really multiracial way. And the advantage of that is asking my mom just to remember all of the people in her life that she loves, some of whom are Black, and a lot of folks in my life who I love, many of whom are Black. And just having her remember that the negative experiences are not definitive, and that folks are not they're not homogenous, right? And also the other piece is real harm happens for real systemic reasons.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think the first time I was mugged, I was just like, okay, so this person clearly needs the thing that I have more than I do. And folks don't commit crimes because they want to. Like there are very few people in the world who are like, I want to harm another human being. And that actually, talking about it like that actually appeals to my mom, who's Catholic, really well. Like, how do we understand systemic stuff? How do we understand interpersonal stuff? And how do we remember that communities are large and dynamic and really diverse? And knowing that it's not going to be an easy fix. Like there's no easy way to resolve that predicament, especially for, like, I'm my mom's only kid. She's my only parent. And like the sense of fear and anxiety is really high. And I really appreciate that when I talk to her, right? And so holding all of that complexity at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories too. All right, so we have a lot of questions that are coming in. So I want to dig into some of them. And I think they actually mirror some of the questions that we've already prepared. So the next question here, I will share my screen real quick, is this one. So essentially, how do we actually combat anti-Black sentiments or behaviors or things that people say in our family that are directly harmful to the Black community? And how do we actually do this in a way that also, I think there were some comments that I was seeing in the chat, how do we do this also in a way that doesn't jeopardize our relationship with our family members? Because I think that's also, you know, we always think about and talk about how Asian people, there's a huge, you know, root in family orientedness, and we're super family oriented, strong family values. And I think sometimes that can get in the way of us feeling like we are able to challenge our elders or our family members who might be saying harmful things. So I think this is a really important question. And I think there's another question that came through the Q&A. I'm looking at my other screen here, where someone asked about how do we talk about anti-Black racism with a family member who was a Trump supporter, for example, and digest a lot of information from news sources like Fox News. So I think they're slightly related, that there's anti-Black racism that we might be witnessing right in front of us within our family, and how do we intervene in those situations?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want folks to get comfortable doing is violating the social contract of expectations in an Asian American family. And again, this doesn't have to be heavy-handed, but interrupting with actually a question of, you know, why is it that you believe that thing versus something else? The Fox News question is a lot stickier, in part because it's fake news. Well, yeah, like
yes.
Yeah, it's not real. And so for those folks, it's almost completely emotions based. Like, what is this narrative giving you? Like, I actually tend to go to a really like basic place with that. Like, does it make you feel better to talk about these people in this way? Does it make you feel safer? Do you feel like unsafe? Right? And why? So that, like, the Fox News, the Trump thing is specific, but the anti-Blackness question in real time, like people are being anti-Black in real time. You can intervene by asking a question then, or because we are in Asian American families and mine is gigantic and this could be like unfathomable, sometimes like interrupt someone when they're speaking, actually talking to them after the fact. So like the way a family party for me is structured is everybody gets there, everyone eats, and then you kind of hang out together, but then people splinter off. So like you have to know how your family functions and know how it operates so that you can have the side conversation. And so, you know, splintering off afterward and talking to my uncle about like, I have some questions about what you said earlier. Can you just talk to me about it? And being, if you want, as respectful as possible in order to preserve that relationship, right?
I think there's also this, I love the idea of following up with people individually. And I think it's contextual, because I would never recommend that in a workplace setting versus in a family setting, especially for Asian families. What I've realized is public humiliation is a huge no-no for my family, right? I think it could backfire in so many different ways. But at the same time, you can actually voice some dissent in a subtle way. And it makes me feel better when I'm in conversation with, let's say, my family and some other Asian family. We're having dinner and somebody says something, even if it's just a,
Yeah.
I don't know about that. And then just kind of moving on. But at least knowing that there is some discomfort here, that something was said that did not sit well with me or you. I think that is a, micro way of showing, a micro resistance, if you will, of showing that something shouldn't be normalized.
Yeah.
When at Awaken, when we do intervention training, some strategies I think is very applicable and useful in that one of the strategies is asking questions. Like, what did you mean by that? Like, I'm really curious. I didn't really understand that joke, or I didn't really understand what you meant by, Black people are blah, 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 blah. Can you explain to me what you mean by that? Like, where did you hear that from? Or what's been your experience? And then also modeling your learning could be really helpful in most cases. I used to think that too, or I read that too, but then I read another thing that said something else. So have you heard that? How do you feel about that? So being able to really use yourself as as sort of an example of how you're learning, you're in process of learning too, because we don't have all the answers, and kind of using humility as a way to engage in that dialogue authentically, I think has been really helpful. Because truthfully, we don't have all the answers. We've had to learn it at some point, right? So being able to really engage them in that genuinely curious place where you're not trying to shame and blame and didactically lecture someone, I think has been really helpful for me in my family setting.
Yeah, I've loved that as a tactic, right? So modeling humility, culturally, that's big for a lot of us. Humility is huge, right? So modeling humility, and I think for me, it also becomes really important because I have a ton of formal education. So knowing that, letting this person know that they can talk to me, that like I'm a work in progress too. The other thing that I will say is like meet that person oftentimes it's helpful for me to meet that person in the tone that I have and the relationship that I have with them. Right. So like if I'm really big on humor with this person, if I'm like a jokey person, I might come at them with some jokes. Right. Or if I've always talked to this person in a very like kind of diminutive way, I might talk to them in that way. That being said, I do think that there is a limit. Like I have 70 people in my family. I don't have to be close to all of them, but there are some folks that I'm really close to that it's important to me that we have a conversation after the anti-Black thing was said, that they don't think that that's okay. Right. So like in all realms of my life, I have what I like to call a strong five. Like I have strong five solidarity friends in whatever realm. And so in my family, when something like that is said and no one says anything, I follow up with the folks that I'm actually really close to talk about anti-Blackness and be like, is this the thing you believe? Right? Like, I just want to have that conversation. And I've done that around a lot of politicized topics.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's a lost cause. With people who are really dogmatic, it can be a lost cause. And that's a great moment to like really think deeply about your relationship with people and where you want it to go, and self-care, and reevaluate, take stock of your other relationships in your family.
Yeah. And it's also not a one-time thing. You talked about this a lot in your writing, how patience is important. I think you're kind of speaking to that right now, where it's, your relationship, it can have longevity. And during that longevity, I think you can have different points of conversations and entry points to be able to have this conversation continually. Because I think sometimes what we end up doing is we engage in one conversation and then it somehow backfires or it worsens our relationship, or we think that it did, and we don't broach that subject again. And I think that is something that we need to get over and be able to just use different tactics creatively, and know that it may take a while for us to be able to meet them where they are and have them meet us where we are.
Yeah, my organizers on the call will know this. So much happens before and after a march, right? Like there are a lot of marches going on right now. Maybe you're one of the folks in Portland or Seattle and you're going out and you're holding a sign, but there are a million things that happen before and after a march. Conversations with your family function a lot like organizing. It's a long game. I want you to think of it like a marathon. This is the Tour de France. It's not a sprint. So when we think about what this looks like, we have to do it in a long way over time, as opposed to, I'm going to give my mom this one article. It's going to work. We're going to be great. That like almost never happens.
Yeah.
And do what you need to do to have patience and endurance in this conversation. And remind yourself all the time that you're doing it because you love this person and you want to build, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to be easy.
Yeah. And I think for that self-care piece that you're talking about, I think it's important for folks to have trusted people that they can go to process this with. And making sure that you are getting the support that you need and you can have a sounding board when you're trying to strategize. Maybe it's your sibling, maybe it's your friends, maybe it's other organizers, maybe it's coming to things like this and creating a community with folks who are struggling with similar challenges. But that's been so helpful for me to be able to process when things don't go well, especially, or before I'm about to have a really tough conversation with my family members or other people in my life, to be able to process that and making sure that that's also not necessarily Black people unless there's consent involved, enthusiastic consent involved, that you're not actually processing that with people that you're trying to be in solidarity with.
Yeah, and I think also this requires for you like dropping into your body and asking yourself, am I ready for this right now? Right? Like there are these moments when my mom will say something out of pocket and I'll have to say, like I'll take stock in that moment and be like, did I eat? Did I sleep? Did I have water? Am I ready? This is going to be at least an hour of pushing this boulder up this hill versus I can also just talk to her about this on Sunday and be like, this is my day off. I don't have to work right now. I'm going to talk to her. She's going to be fresh out of church and in a good mood. You know, like you have to also really know yourself. And I think knowing yourself will really help you get to a point where you can, you know, push the needle on your family.
Yeah, absolutely. I think knowing yourself, knowing your own identities too, and knowing your trigger points, because some of the things that activate me may be very different than what activates you all, right? So I think in conversation around race or any type of tough, challenging conversations, there may be different things that activate you differently, and have a plan for how you're going to de-escalate yourself. Because if you crack in that moment when you're having that conversation and somebody, you know, your parent or your family member says something that really activates you, it's going to be hard for you to continue that conversation in a way that is successful. So I think just managing your activators is also a really good practice for you to just always pay attention to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm going to ask this question that was voted the top. So it's from an anonymous attendee, and it says, any advice on how to unpack the model minority myth with family members who have really bought into it, especially the ideas of aspirational whiteness, which is what you talked about on your NPR interview, and that we work harder than any other groups and we are thus more deserving?
It's such a comforting idea, isn't it? It's a really nice, like the idea that I was born to succeed feels really great.
And also the idea of like, if you work really hard, you can make it type of trope. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have done a lot of work around the model minority myth, and I like to start with the reality that it is really comforting, and start with the idea that it is really nice to think that if all you do is get a degree, if all you do is work really hard, that you will succeed. Here's how that hasn't worked for Asian Americans. Like the bamboo ceiling is real. I love that people on tech are like 30% representation. Girl, we are half the world. We are like 50% of the whole world. And we are excited for 30% of representation. That's not real, you know? So thinking about the fact that the bamboo ceiling is real, that if you dig into that number, the model minority thing isn't actually true. So like LGBTQ API folks aren't successful in the same way. Trans API folks aren't successful in the same way. So one, talking about the fact that it's just on its face patently can be untrue. And two, just take folks through the lineage of it. right? Talk about Japanese internment. Talk about the fact that this is actually something we created on purpose. And talk about the fact that it's dehumanizing in its own way, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't actually know all the answers to the math questions. And teachers have an expectation of that for kids in schools.
Mm-hmm.
So that when students like me, I didn't become an overachiever until very late in life. My friends like to say, you know, I didn't actually go enough to high school in order to be a part of the high school. So the reality that for so many of us, it's actually a fallacy and it was crafted and can be really harmful. And the other piece is it's really divisive. Like, the model minority myth is actually created to erase politicized, organizing Asian Americans and create a divide where none actually should exist. Mm-hmm. Right? So we can talk about racial justice. We can talk about the fact that it's harmful specifically to Southeast Asians, Hmong folks, Cambodian folks. And we can talk about the fact that don't we want to be seen as human beings outside of our ability to, you know, get a paycheck. Mm-hmm. All of these are ways that I've kind of pushed my family members at different moments to think about it. And I absolutely have family members who are all about it, who love that idea, until they realized. I have a cousin who kept getting shut out of a promotion until she eventually quit the company. And that's actually happened to a few of my cousins who are women. And that's a really great example and a moment for me to talk to them about the model minority thing, and that their expectations of it being real were very, very false.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the bamboo ceiling is real. And also I think the statistics around how Asians are the least likely group to be promoted into leadership positions, right? So that validates the bamboo ceiling. And also when we talk about the model minority myth, we're talking about a very specific type of Asians that fit into that mold and often leave behind a whole groups of Asian people who don't fit into that category. And often I think folks who benefit from that most is East Asians and South Asians, who are overrepresented in these fields. Because when we say 30% in tech representation wise, we're not actually including the diverse diaspora of Asian people, right? And there's a lot of Southeast Asian folks. There's a lot of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander folks who are not included in that number. And I know in the U.S., the Asian community has the widest and the fastest growing wealth gap. So there's a lot of rich Asians, and then there's a lot of poor Asians. And I think all of those things get muddled and erased. And I think that is by design, how we experience the unique oppression against Asian people in this country is erasure of those differences, and also the incredible activism work that we have been doing for centuries in this country, right? That don't get lifted because it's seen as not ideal for white supremacy to continue to exist. So yeah.
I think we're also then talking about the funneling of resources, right? If we think that Asian Americans as a homogenous racial group are doing well on income indicators, then no one's going to try to account for the fact that Cambodian Hmong folks live at rates of poverty higher than Black and Latinx folks. Right. So it's a really great way to actually tangibly, materially harm Asian people as well.
Yeah. Something that I've asked in return when people say this about, why can't people just work hard? Because that's a narrative that I hear all the time, not only from my family members, but from Asian people in general and other communities as well, where, and I think it kind of gets intertwined with anything around police brutality too, where that gets projected in different ways, like, maybe he shouldn't have resisted, or maybe he should have done this. And I think it's important for us to show examples of other minority groups, other people of color groups struggling and working hard, right? And asking those questions like, do you think that they're not working hard? And that's why this wealth gap exists. And then being prepared to talk about the systemic ways in which that folks were marginalized and oppressed throughout history. That's where we have to actually do our homework to be able to know and pull some of these stories that's going to, you know, get them to come to the conclusion that, oh, wow, like there's a lot that I didn't know. I didn't know that there were laws that ban people from purchasing houses in these types of neighborhoods, or, you know, redlining, or whatever it is. I think you can use so many different examples to paint the picture that even though people work really hard, they're not able to achieve certain things because of the systemic forces that are that exist in this country. Yeah.
I also really think it's important to keep it personal, right? And so when we bring up these stories, like I was talking to my partner about this. My partner is also Asian. And we were talking about this like meritocracy thing that happens for Asian Americans. And if you trace my family's story, there are actually these huge moments where they've had really tangible advantages, right? Whether it's financial literacy, whether it's an extended family. Like at a certain point, we couldn't afford our home anymore. And my mom knew to rent it out and move in with her brother. And so we had somewhere to go. Now imagine if in the recession of the 80s, if we didn't have an extended family member, we would have just lost the house, right? And so knowing, like having financial literacy, having resources, whether or not that's your other family members, and also knowing that you came from the first wave of Vietnamese refugees was like middle class, was middle income. And we got here and we suddenly were not middle class, but we definitely understood that in order to, you have to save your money in a particular way. You have to function in a particular way. And we were citizens very quickly, right? And so there are all of these things, if you just dig around in people's stories and know them very well, that you can bring up as a compare and contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love all these questions that are coming up. And a lot of folks are doing anonymous. I think it's because they don't want to come on screen. Okay, so the next question is, do you have any advice for Asian Black interracial dating? My parents are really unsupportive, which can be super tough on our relationship.
I love that this got really personal really quick. Any just like blanket tips?
Yeah, it says any specific advice.
One of the things that I know fellow organizers have done is a lot of back end work before you bring somebody to meet your family. Make sure that it's the safest space that it can be, right? And that means you might have to ask some uncomfortable questions, like, I'm dating this person. They are a Black person, and I need to know that you're not going to do things that are wild. Like, I don't want no hair touching, no, you know, like I know folks who are even from non-Black families of color where folks will like touch someone's body. Be like, look at your musculature. Like, yeah, it's wild. So making sure that you have that conversation in advance. And also for me, you might have to body block a person. You just have to be ready for that. Like I have had to get in someone's face and like actually stand between people before. Yeah. And so be ready to have to intervene in really specific strategic ways. Yeah. Right. So the conversation should happen in advance. And then on the other side, be ready to do some work in real time if you're going to engage with that person or engage with your family and your romantic, intimate partner in the same setting.
Yeah. I think one of the mistakes that I made when I was younger, when I was in high school, I brought in a friend who's Black, and I did not do my work of preparing my family to be able to create a safe environment for that person to be. And I think that's such an important thing for us to be able to do some harm reduction work proactively, because that, like your desire to want to introduce and integrate somebody into the family, I think that's really understandable. And I think the potential harm is so great that I think we have to be realistic about the work that we need to do in order to ensure that there is no additional harm that's being caused by our own people.
I actually also think that this might have to do with not necessarily harm reduction, but our unwillingness to actually just bring it up in real time. Like, I just want us to get comfortable with bringing it up. I remember I was dating someone and I like took kind of initiative around it. And I was like, I want to go to dinner. Let's go to dinner. And I like brought it up, and I was like, I was really honest about it, right? I was like, I'm worried about bringing this person home. Like
Yeah.
straight up, I'm worried about bringing this person home because you've expressed these ideas, and I know I love you, and I know you're really good with me. I just want to make sure that that goes, like, the way that you care about and love me extends to other people that I care about and love, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I would also involve at the right time the partner in the conversation around where their boundaries are and where they're comfortable, where they're, comfortable either pushing back in real time with your family members or having that conversation in advance so that y'all can prep together and how to navigate that situation. All right, folks, we are over time, and there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to that I am hopeful that at some point we'll be able to share some resources. So we're going to follow up with you all with some resources. And one question that we didn't specifically address that I think we can take the next couple of minutes to spell out is how do we engage our family members who may not speak fluent English, and there's cultural and language barrier. There's actually a ton of resources that are being put out by people who are translating resources into different languages. And this may not be the right tool for everyone, but I had success with my dad and my mom using the Letters for Black Lives, which is a letter written by Asian Americans who translated the letter in multiple different languages. And I sent that to my dad and my mom, and they were very receptive to it, and it started the conversation with me. But again, I know it's not going to work for everyone, but there are so many resources. I know, Kim, you have a ton of resources that you can spell out for people right now.
Yeah, I actually would also say you can start with the letter and maybe pull pieces of it, right? So it's translated, which is nice because you know which pieces might work. A4BL has got some great, Asians for Black Lives has some great translated materials right now. If you poke around on something like Viet Solidarity Network or on Twitter, you're going to find a lot of different translations. Sometimes there's even a full dictionary. Like I've seen it in Tagalog, I've seen it in Korean. So just start doing some hunting, and sometimes it doesn't have to be like, I want to discourage folks from thinking you have to have the language perfectly. You can also just use the language that you have, because this is the language that you're using with your parent or with your siblings anyway. So you don't have to, like, the way that Viet for Black Lives is translated is not necessarily the way that I would say it. But I might start there and just be like, what do you think of this translation? Right. And then that opens up a conversation for you to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I also loved it. Part of those letters is and examples of how Asian folks have worked in solidarity with Black folks in the past, right? Whether that is the farm workers movement led by Latinos and Filipinos, or so I think there's so many different examples that we can use that could be a source of empowerment too. Look, like, we've been doing this work with Black folks and other marginalized groups, so we could be a part of this. And I think giving them some examples of hope and possibility, I think also is a really good strategy. Yeah. I am so grateful for everyone for tuning into this conversation and for keep going, right? This is, I think, not an easy journey, but a necessary one and an empowering one for all of us. And I'm also so grateful for Dr. Tran for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and expertise with all the community members. Any last parting words that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm just grateful to everyone. Thank you so much for your questions. I would just encourage you all to stay patient with yourselves and with your family. It took us centuries to get to a place where anti-Blackness is real, where imperialism is real, where all of these realities that we live with every day exist in a common sense way. So be patient with yourself, be forgiving and spacious with yourself, and make sure to, strike that balance between self-care and commitment.
Yes. Absolutely. I know there's folks who are organizing, the people who are on this call. There's a Slack group that I think that people are joining and stuff like that. So let's definitely stay in touch because we can't do this alone. You're not alone in this struggle and the challenges that you're facing. We're here for you. I'm rooting for y'all. Let's keep going. And thank you again.
Thanks so much, folks.
Bye.